Hello, guys. Welcome back to another edition of video recorded lectures. And at this time, we're going to focus on high context versus low context cultures. Now, this topic is in connection to cultural communication, specifically the approaches of cultural communication. So this week, we're going to end up with this one, with one of the many aspects of low context and high context cultures. And let's take a look into how our knowledge in these two concepts can help us become more conversant, more conscious, and perhaps more adept when it comes to communicating with people coming from different cultural backgrounds. At the end of this series of video recorded lectures on low context and high context cultures, you will have one small team task, which you're going to, of course, carry out in collaboration with members of your team. So I hope you will follow this video recorded lectures, and they will be arranged in order, of course, so that you will know exactly which one to view first and which one to view the next and the last. Now, each recording, by the way, may run for more than 10 minutes, but not more than 15 minutes. I can assure you that. Nevertheless, at this point, let's talk about high context and low context cultures. Perhaps some of you may have heard of these terms before, but for those who are or who might probably consider these terms to be new to you, let's talk about this. And how can this help you, by the way, for those who are planning to work abroad or probably do some travelings in the future, how your knowledge on this matter can help you become, let's put it this way, really good when navigating different people, different groups of people from different cultural backgrounds. When you talk about high context culture, these cultures, by the way, rely heavily on non-verbal communication. That means you always have to rely on subtle situational cues when communicating with people who belong to this particular type of culture. Now, to break this down further, I'd like to provide you more information as to what exactly comprises a high context culture. A high context culture, by the way, basically focuses more on the context of the conversation. And it's usually the communication with people coming from this culture is often indirect. That means you have to look into clues through the gestures, facial expressions, even the silence perhaps of that individual talking to you, so that you can pick up ideas on whether that person to whom you're communicating or with whom you're communicating really got your point and probably has a negative or a positive response to whatever you're communicating with that individual. Now, people from these cultures expect their listeners to understand the unsaid. So when you communicate with someone who comes from a high context culture, you have to look into three things: nonverbal cues. You have to look into the nonverbal language of that individual. Look at the gestures, facial expressions, actions, the movement of the body, even perhaps the raising of the eyebrows. If you can remember, I gave you an example of my experience with a group of Indian students, and I talked about the bobbing of the head, okay? The bobbing, this one. And when would you know if they understood or did not understand what you have just said to them or said to an Indian individual when that person bobs his or her head? Apart from nonverbal cues, social hierarchies also matter a lot. So when you communicate with someone coming from this culture, you have to ask yourself, you have to ask people around, how much respect should I give this person? Especially if this person happens to be high ranking in comparison to me. Last but not least, relationships. How long do you know each other? How long have you established your relationship? Is your relationship purely professional, or it has reached a personal level too? Because aside from working with someone who you consider your boss, that boss of yours already is someone whom you can consider as your friend or even a best friend, and the feeling is mutual. Now, there are specific characteristics that people manifest, people coming from high context cultures. We're talking about communication here. So one of this is that communication is implicit. That means it's not direct. You have to read in between the lines. You have to look at the actions, the gestures, and whatnot. And sometimes having gotten to know that person for a long time may allow you to be at ease and you won't be confused anymore if there are things that you don't get with what that person is talking about with you. Apart from that, nonverbal cues like tone of the voice, gestures, and facial expressions should be considered, should be noted as much as possible by you, of course, if you happen to be communicating with someone belonging to the high context culture. But the thing is, in our case, as Asians and as Filipinos in particular, we happen to belong to this culture. We happen to be individuals who rely more on subtle forms of communication, nonverbal language, hierarchy, social hierarchies, and relationships. Long-term relationships, that's what I mentioned a while ago, and strong interpersonal connections are prioritized. So this also factor in. So when you're communicating with someone, for example, you're in Japan, you're working there, and you happen to be communicating with someone senior than you must be careful with how you talk to that person, how you bow also your head. There's a certain degree on the bowing of the head when you greet someone who is senior than you. So if your senior supervisor bows slightly lower, you have to bow your head even lower than your senior supervisor. That's how it goes, by the way. This is also based on my experience when I had the chance to work in South Korea years ago. I had to make sure I'm careful when it comes to bowing in front of my senior supervisor. Decision making can be slow as it requires building consensus. So what does this mean? So when you negotiate, when you ask someone to make a decision on a matter that concerns you at that point, you have to wait. You have to wait for a period or time before that person gives a final say. So that's why it's necessary that when you raise a concern with someone who belongs to a high context culture, you do it as early as possible so that when the resolution is needed, you can act on it, you can provide it when the time still allows you to do that. Okay. Nevertheless, here are examples of countries that happen to have high context or they happen to have a high context culture. We have, of course, Japan. Now, Japan, by the way, when it comes to communication, it's nuanced. What does that mean? You have to be careful when it comes to reading their gestures, their facial expressions. Japanese people have what they call tatemae and honne. Tatemae, that means that's the face that they show to you, but that's not the real. They don't show the real emotions. They may be smiling with you or at you. They may be showing a happy facial expression, but deep inside, it may not necessarily be. Honne is the face that they show when they're being truthful to you. It only happens when a Japanese individual has finally established trust in you. Japanese people don't build trust immediately. Even if you happen to be a business partner, even if you're negotiating in a business context, it doesn't actually happen overnight. You have to establish trust for different in different experiences or situations. Now, in Japan also, politeness and indirectness are expected, particularly in business. For example, saying yes may not indicate agreement, that's what I said a while ago, but acknowledgement of the conversation. So if a Japanese boss says yes to you, you have to, do a double check on that, by the way. Apart from that, formal titles and the seniority system rather, are critical in a Japanese workplace. And the Japanese communication style is often indirect to avoid embarrassment or conflict, known as saving face. So the saving face is also shared, by the way, with some Asian brothers and sisters of ours. For example, in Thailand, they have to make sure that when they say something, they're sure with it. Otherwise, if they commit an error, they don't have the opportunity to save their face. Reputation is important to them, by the way. Now, when it comes to Chinese people, now, when it comes to people from this country, relationships or Quan play a major role in business dealings and conversations, often involve reading between the lines rather than direct statements. So when you communicate with someone at the workplace or in a business context, you have to make sure that you give your very best, your best attitude, the best traits that you have. You have to show to that Chinese individual that you're someone that can be trusted, so that in future transactions, that person is going to put his or her trust in you. It's the same thing with Japanese people. But when it comes to Chinese people, trusting another person from another culture is, well, they take it at a whole uh, different level. So if you'll ask me, how do we go about this one? Well, the best thing is you have to experience it yourself. Okay. There's no other thing that can help, that can compensate learning about culture than immersing into the culture of another person or another group of people. When it comes to UAE, it's different, by the way. If you talk about UAE or Saudi Arabia or Middle Eastern countries, okay, but I'm just using UAE here as an example. Communication can be ambiguous, and understanding context, including social hierarchy and tradition, is crucial. So you have to do a double checking again, especially when it comes to communicating with someone from a Middle Eastern country. You have to make sure that an agreement is achieved and it's clear, and most especially, you put it down into writing. It's important for people in the Middle East that agreements are actually achieved in documents. They document it. I'm not saying that they're the only people who do this, by the way. People around the world from different cultures, from different countries, they do this. But in UAE or in any Middle Eastern country, documenting an agreement, and most especially when communicating with them, you have to be sure that you have to reiterate. You have to ask them again if it's final or not. So these are just examples that I can share with you when it comes to people from countries that have high context culture. When it comes to the low context culture, it's different. Cultures from this part of the world rely heavily on words to convey meaning in communication. So, well, you have to say you're safe. The thing is, it's just safer to communicate with someone coming from a low context culture, because whatever that person says, he means it, by the way. Well, for one thing, people coming from a low context culture emphasize direct, clear, and explicit communication. They want to give out directly the main point. So they mean business with what they say. Characteristics of people, sorry, this is not low context, but this is supposed to be, this is not, yeah, sorry. I have to correct myself. This is low context culture. But when it comes to this one, I have to correct myself. This is supposed to be low context culture. I forgot to replace this one. But nevertheless, let that correction be taken note by you. Okay, when it comes to low context culture, communication is explicit and straightforward, by the way. There is less reliance on nonverbal cues, but more on the words. So, for example, if you communicate with an American, if you talk to an American individual, you have, well, whatever that person says to you, he means that. Most Americans are direct or straightforward when they carry out conversations. Efficiency and clarity are valued more than relationship building in conversations, compared with people from from high context cultures. Rather, for you to understand who they really are when they communicate with you, you have to establish a relationship and you get to know that person in that relationship, may be professional or personal, so that you get to know exactly how the person communicates with you. What's your communication dynamic with him? When it comes to people coming from the low context culture, they want to save time. They want to be clear. They want to be direct with what they say. They don't want to waste your time when they communicate with you. So when they ask something from you, you have to respond to it immediately. Time is gold to them. Now, decision making can be faster because communication is direct and task focused. So countries like the US of A, by the way, if you talk about Americans, they typically value directness and getting to the point. And doing this is often encouraged in business settings, by the way. They may come off a bit rude, especially for people like us coming from high context cultures, but it should not be taken as something as rude. They simply communicate in that manner. They're very direct. Okay. They want to save time as much as possible. They don't want to waste your time. When it comes to this people from this country, Germany, it's a different case. German culture emphasizes clarity and precision in language. That's why they're very careful when it comes to the words that they say. So when they communicate with you in English and you communicate with them in English too, when you mispronounce a word, they tend to clarify that. They tend to verify if what they heard from you is actually what they understood. Now, they do this one more particularly rather in business, where contracts and details are meticulously discussed to avoid misunderstandings. So Germans are very, let's put it this way, perfectionist. Okay, especially when words are involved, both being spoken and written. When it comes to Australia, yep, Australians tend to prefer clear, open communication and often value humor in conversation, which may be lost on high context communicators. So in this case, when you talk with Australians, they can be sarcastic too from time to time. They tend to put in some jokes, sarcasm. Uh, Bear in mind, they're the cousins of people from Great Britain. And British people, to tell you honestly, I have communicated. I have a few friends from Great Britain. It's always a staple in our conversation that they always put in jokes or sarcastic jokes. And I have gotten used to it. And sometimes I reply with sarcasm too. So when it comes to high context and low context cultures, this is how we can look at these people. Those who are in the upper part, the base part of the pyramid, happen to belong to the high context culture. So those people that are at the apex of the pyramid, at the bottom, they belong to the low context cultures. So I hope this clarification, this explanation of high context and low context cultures have added more to your knowledge when it comes to communicating with people from these cultures. So thank you very much for the time that you spent, and I hope you'll continue watching the next set of recorded lectures still in connection with high context and low context cultures. Take good care of yourself, and bye-bye.